Climate change has been ravaging the working class of the world for decades now. Every year we see more intense natural disasters, whether it be floods wiping out entire communities, wildfires displacing people en masse, or hurricanes doing both, in addition to destroying infrastructure in communities that already have poor health care and crumbling roads. We see crop failures as certain areas of the world become too hot to grow food, or changing temperatures make already existing pest problems even worse. Meanwhile, agricultural companies have been causing mass deforestation and ecological damage for the sake of profit, and locals who watch their backyards destroyed see no benefit. As the working class of the world bears the largest burden, the ruling class of the world, the capitalists, see massive profits. The oil companies, food conglomerates, weapons contractors, and tech companies are partying it up on yachts while they hourly receive millions of dollars from the labor of the same workers who suffer from the effects of environmental destruction. Their suffering is the capitalist lifeblood, because to ease their suffering would mean mutual aid on a massive scale, and that is antithetical to profit in capitalist competition.
Maximum profits at all costs, that's built into the system. It's a structure of the system. It's not something that is just a preference for some of the elite, but they are driven by the need to accumulate ever more amounts of capital.
Markets depend on there being a race to the bottom for cheap labor, and the existence of cheap labor depends on poor conditions and austerity so that workers will be willing to work for less in order to survive. The governmental system that guarantees that markets can operate more or less freely is liberal democracy, even referred to as free market democracies. Democracy sounds wonderful, free market not so much, depending on who you ask. Even most capitalists don't actually love free markets. They prefer markets that work in their favor, since the whole point of competition is to control the market. The labor, the raw materials, the real estate, the finance and stock market, every capitalist wants to have a monopoly so that they can control prices and undercut competition to maximize their profits.
If you are an operator, and there were some originally, who wanted to do it better and leave a better result, it was hard for them to do because that puts you at a competitive disadvantage. In other words, it's more costly for you to mine than it is for your competitors.
Without a monopoly, you're forced to compete with someone else who may get a better deal on raw materials, a cheaper source of labor, or perhaps more investors from the stock market. This is the way that our society is set up, and it is the type of society that our democracy is supposed to govern. This might make you wonder, though, if workers make up the majority in society and capitalists are the minority, how come workers don't just participate in the democracy to vote for an end to this inequality and environmental destruction? Democracy is majority rule, right? Well, that's why it's called liberal democracy. Our democracy is based on a system of checks and balances set up by the capitalist class in the United States back when they were in their infancy. The point of the type of system of government they set up was to protect existing property relations to their benefit. They purposefully designed our democracy in such a way to be representative, in order to prevent the masses from being able to hold too much sway over decisions. They were influenced by ancient Greek philosophers such as Aristotle to fear the majority rule, because they recognized that the majority in society were the poor, whose interests were directly opposed to that of the minority, the rich. For Aristotle, his democracy was for the slave owners only, and existed to preserve the system of slavery back then, which had its own property relations and conflicting class interests. Another big difference between Aristotle's democracy and current-day democracy is the concept of human rights. The idea that every human being is born with inherent, inalienable rights, and that the government must protect those rights. The problem with these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to name a few, is that they are vague, and only provide protection from infringement by the government. They are not in any way guaranteed or provided by society. They are more so representative of privilege rather than rights. You have the privilege not to be killed, have your land taken, or your property stolen by the government. The majority of the working class in the world, however, already don't have any land and own very little personal property.
It doesn't mean that everyone is going to have equal results. Because in a free system, people are free to pursue their own interests, and the starting point is not equality, because people are not equal. People are not born equal. They're not born in equal circumstances. They're not born with equal abilities or equal intelligence or aptitudes. I mean, you can see that in virtually any aspect of life, from sports. Not everyone is going to make the NFL.
The thing is that many of these rights being upheld depend directly on environmental integrity. Whether we are talking about the environment in the broad sense, such as your family, your community, your home, etc., or in the more narrow sense, such as the ecology and natural cycles which all of the latter depend upon for their existence. The proper functioning of these things, society and nature, are interrelated and inseparable.
And as a result, we've had the outcome of disasters. We often think of it as disasters for the working class because of the exploitation they experience, the racism, the sexism, the various forms of oppression that flow out of that, from police brutality to imperialist wars. But now we're really seeing very clearly how capitalism is working willy-nilly to damage the planet in a way that will make life extremely difficult for the working class and even for the ruling class.
Society gets the raw materials it needs to reproduce itself from nature, exclusively through labor. Nature exists independently of society, but as long as a society exists that needs nature, its proper functioning depends on having a harmonious relationship with the society which uses it. The way that labor is carried out, in other words, must respect environmental integrity. But can a governmental system that presupposes a certain mode of production guarantee environmental integrity? Can it protect the rights that depend on this environmental integrity?
In these mines in the year 1942, and we can all remember that year, there were 71,035 total accidents, of which 1,471 were fatal and 69,564 were non-fatal. Be it known that each non-fatal accident averages a loss of 40 days' work time for each man injured.
As Westra demonstrates in her paper, corporations can and will argue in a court of law that they do not harm the rights of others through their environmental destruction, and they have massive amounts of money and resources that can be used to make their case. Certain policies can be pushed for that aim to create market incentives for more green commodities, but the production of those commodities in a competitive market still depends on the same system of production. Even policies that force companies to do some sort of environmental restoration or set up barriers and hurdles to certain kinds of farming, mining, drilling, etc., only serve as band-aid solutions to a much larger problem. The truth is that what we need is not a symbolic democracy that exists to protect the interests of the same capitalists who are most responsible for climate change and ecological degradation. We need the abolition of classes and private property, and for workers to make decisions collectively on how things are produced and distributed. It is the commodity form of production itself that harms environmental integrity, and that can only be done away with by destroying the social relations that revolve around the commodity. Focusing on use values rather than exchange values by itself eliminates the need for capitalists, since their profit depends on the buying and selling of commodities. For them, use value is secondary. Their primary concern is exchange. Without exchange, they can't exploit labor and through that exploit the use values available in nature, disrupting natural systems and therefore disrupting environmental integrity. Democracy that guarantees the right to exploit labor and resources is nothing but democracy for the capitalists. What we need is democracy over the collective ownership of the means of production, and that means getting rid of capitalism.
If you think about the overall structure of the capitalist system and the kind of irrational way it's emerged with the needs for high levels of consumption of energy, nothing short of a radical restructuring of the whole society is going to have any hope of improving conditions.
Westra, in her critique of liberal democracy, makes one of her main points the fact that even in the most democratic countries in the world, especially the US, they are no more able to protect people from environmental hazards than countries which are considered despotic or undemocratic. One of the reasons that this is able to happen, according to Westra, is the idea of the social contract, which is the notion that government is founded on the consent of the people. Democracy is supposedly the ultimate form of this, because every citizen has the right to vote and use their voice. However, this idea is also used to justify the environmental destruction and hazards that threaten communities. The justification goes that because consumers participate in the consumption of goods that require environmental destruction, they are consenting to the effects and externalities that result, including any risk of harm to their own health that may come as a consequence of their choice. Which is another point which Westra brings up that is a symptom of liberal democracy, the illusion of choice. We are constantly told that under the most democratic system in the world, our freedom comes from our ability to choose. But this choice is mostly an illusion, for a few reasons. One, because many of the different choices we get to make when it comes to consumerism are simply different forms of a good that is owned by the same company. Or, they may be owned by different companies, but produced in the same facility using very similar production processes. Secondly, most of our choices are a result of manufactured demand. Massive amounts of money and resources are poured into marketing and psychological research to produce advertising to convince people that they need a product, which they oftentimes don't. In addition, they can advertise these things as green or fair trade to make it seem as if the consumer is making a more informed and moral choice, when oftentimes there are caveats and externalities. The consumers also do not have a choice in what is produced, and thus are subject to market demands which, as stated above, are often manipulated and manufactured. A final reason that democracies cannot protect people from environmental hazards is that corporations, which are by and large the greatest contributors to pollution, carbon emissions, and other destructive habits, are counted as individuals under the law, and thus can claim protections from accountability on the basis of having their rights infringed upon. Westra's proposed solution to these problems is an acceptance of the risk thesis, which states that individuals have a claim against potential risks of harm to individual rights and bodily autonomy. Shoehorning this into the framework of liberalism and human rights would, in her view, provide precedent for holding corporations accountable for practices that produce environmental hazards and extrajudicial means of preventing these hazards. There are several problems with this, however. One problem is that this also provides precedent for holding workers accountable for participating in the process. Corporations are treated as individuals, yes, and therefore can be held legally accountable as individuals. But obviously, corporations also have massive amounts of money and resources to fight against charges in court. And they also have much larger influence over the economy, land, and resources, which makes it much harder for a capitalist state to truly hold them accountable if it means hurting the national economy. Workers, on the other hand, often cannot afford legal protections, and their individual actions don't impact the national economy by themselves. Thus, they would be highly vulnerable to charges against them, and this could be used as a way to shift blame and responsibility from those who contribute the most to environmental harm onto those who contribute the least yet suffer the largest burden. We already see this with carbon taxes, which would disproportionately impact workers who are often forced to drive long commutes and cannot afford electric vehicles.
The carbon tax, is sort of the go-to policy suggestion from economists. The experience with the carbon tax in a few places has not been particularly advantageous. In other words, it hasn't had much impact. Now, in economic theory, if you use the neoclassical view of things, then it seems like it should work, and that companies should therefore be willing to react to that. In order for a carbon tax system to work, you would have to have enormous incentives, because the current infrastructure is such that you actually need to have fossil fuel used. It's the cities, for example, and the suburbs. There's huge commuting distances, and there's very poor public transportation. So in order for anybody to get to a job, I mean, here in Washington, D.C., we have people working in construction who live out in far western Virginia. They live in Berryville, they live in Winchester, and they drive 2.5 hours just to get to work because that's the infrastructure that we have developed over the years. And of course, then they build more roads and to accommodate more traffic. Okay, so in other words, the whole system that we're living in is one that demands higher levels of energy.
Another problem, which Westra mentions herself, is that it is extremely difficult to legally pinpoint accountability and risk to health or well-being when it comes to environmental hazards. Often risks to people in other countries are not even accounted for, because blame is placed on their country's lack of environmental regulations or their government. And service economies which owe their products to the cheap labor and exploitation of the third world benefit from placing blame anywhere but the U.S. companies that own mines, factories, and farms in the global south. But the most important problem with this proposed solution is that it does not tackle the underlying root cause of disruption of environmental integrity, and thus integrity of individual rights and the rights of communities, which is capitalism. But you may be asking at this point, sure, your criticisms of capitalism seem to be fair, but what alternative is there? Karl Marx never said anything about nature, and what about the ecological destruction in the USSR and China? I don't have time to address the claims against past communist projects, but to say that Marx was not concerned with nature is completely wrong. John Bellamy Foster, a Marxist environmentalist, writes, "As part of his commitment to ecological materialism, Marx recognized that natural systems, such as the nutrient cycle, had a particular metabolism, an exchange of matter and energy, which operated independently of and in relation to human society, allowing for their regeneration and/or continuance." Marx's analysis of nature and society didn't stop there, however. He even talked about how the development of capitalist agriculture caused soil degradation during his time. Marx developed this metabolic analysis in the historically specific context of the emerging soil crisis in England in the 19th century. He noted that the soil required specific nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, to maintain its ability to produce crops, because as crops grew, they took up these nutrients. But the division between town and country due to the enclosure movement increasingly collected the population in urban areas. As a result, food and fiber were shipped from the countryside to distant markets, transferring soil nutrients to cities where they accumulated as waste rather than being returned to the soil. And furthermore, today, Foster writes, capital attempts to bridge whatever rifts it creates through technological fixes, such as the use of artificial fertilizers to maintain production in the face of systematic depletion of soil nutrients, without properly addressing the social causes of the metabolic rift. Such artificial solutions simply shift the problem elsewhere, creating additional environmental concerns and compounding the overall problem. We see this same problem repeated today with the advent of green technology, which promises to provide us with the same standard of living and allow capitalism to go on without harming the environment or producing fossil fuels.
There's a phrase that climate activists often use called greenwashing, which is like whitewashing, except it's using a sort of a phony kind of let's do a little better with the environment, and we can if we get a little more solar panels in place, we'll be okay, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of greenwashing that goes on, and I think that's really what green capitalism is all about. Now, there's an even more pernicious side to it, which is that a lot of the major corporations have figured out that they can make a lot of money off of greenwashing. And so there's the whole solar panel industry, the wind turbine industry, and there's many other things that are going on that really aren't solving the fundamental problems of climate change, but are really nice ways to make a lot of money. So even when they've sort of taken the impulse that many people have, millions of people have around the world to try to stop climate change and turned it into a money-making operation like everything else in capitalism.
The issue here is that capitalism produces things for the purpose of exchange, not for use. And in order to accumulate profits, there has to be continuous return on investment. It's the same reason that planned obsolescence exists. There cannot be a point where a capitalist has sold enough solar panels. In order to keep their profits flowing, they have to keep producing. And even if that capitalist decides to stop, it just opens the door for someone else to start producing for a market that still exists. The production and transportation of things like solar panels and batteries requires massive amounts of fossil fuels. And even if we get to a point where all of that is powered electrically, that only means that we have to now mine massive amounts of lithium, cobalt, and coltan in order to keep up with the ever-increasing demand.
Once you have produced these solar panels, they wear out. And the turbines wear out, and the disposal of all those things is also extremely costly and detrimental to the environment. So while those wind turbines and solar panels have some marginal impact on reducing the use of fuels that actually directly put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the outcome on the other end is also somewhat detrimental.
Wars have already been fought over oil, and even now, as we are just entering this age of battery power, wars are already starting to emerge over raw materials used for tech, as China and the US struggle for control over the Congo. I shouldn't even have to mention the impact of war on climate change and pollution. Lastly, I want to talk about value. Since the topic at hand here is capitalism's ability to protect environmental integrity, ecosystems have inherent value, as there are things that hurt the natural cycles and processes that go on within them, and things which can disrupt the entire system and cause harm to the well-being of organisms, including human beings. But what do these values mean for human society? Capitalism also has value, but unlike the inherent value of commodities that most classical economists talk about, there are different kinds of value that are important in capitalism. The one that is most important for its existence is exchange value, because the system of capitalism depends on the exchange of things. Another type of value is use value, the value that comes from something being able to satisfy a need or a want. Use values exist everywhere in nature already. Water, for example, is a use value that satisfies thirst. Exchange value can only exist when things are exchanged for other things, and that presupposes a certain type of social relation, as well as a certain type of value that is shared between the two things being exchanged. This value cannot be use value, since two use values cannot be commensurable. Thus, exchange value is something different. This contradiction between exchange value and use value is the main contradiction that makes up something called the Lauderdale paradox, of which John Bellamy Foster says, Lauderdale, in the paradox with which he is now associated, argued that there was a contradiction between public wealth and private riches, such that an increase in the latter normally diminished the former. Public wealth, he wrote, may be accurately defined to consist of all that man desires as useful or delightful to him. Such goods have use value and thus constitute wealth. But value, or exchange value, as opposed to wealth, required something additional, consisting of all that man desires as useful or delightful to him, which exists in a degree of scarcity. This led Lauderdale to argue that if one creates scarcity in such abundant but necessary elements of life as water, air, and food, one could enhance private riches and indeed the riches of the country, but only at the expense of public wealth. This paradox leads to absurd outcomes, one of which we can see today is the burning of crops to maintain high food prices. The abundance of food would certainly be useful to feed millions of hungry people, but capitalism is not concerned with this use. It's concerned with exchange and increasing private wealth, which means that abundance must necessarily be prevented and use value diminished in order to foster that increase. Lastly, Foster says of Marx, for Marx, Sustaining nature was usually looked at from an exclusively human perspective in terms of sustaining use values, but he also referred at times to nature's right to not be reduced to a commodity at all. Thus, he quoted Thomas Muntzer's famous statement objecting to the fact that in developing bourgeois society, all creatures have been made into property. The fish in the water, the birds in the air, the plants on the earth, all living things must also become free. Environmental integrity depends on the abundance and respect of use values, of which capitalism must necessarily destroy for the purpose of profiting from exchange. Whether it be the pollution of clean drinking water to ensure cheap and efficient mining, the destruction of soil to grow ever-increasing amounts of corn to feed livestock, or the fuel-burning transportation of phosphorus to replenish those same soils, the solution to every one of these problems incurs an extra cost for the capitalist, which is an existential threat to outcompeting those who can produce for less. And oftentimes, the extra cost gets shifted onto workers, who either get sped up, laid off, or paid less, in addition to the suffering from the effects of environmental degradation. If we produced for use instead of exchange, the extra cost would simply be the extra labor that goes into ensuring a healthy environment, which would pay off tremendously in the long run.